So, hello, my name is Professor Neil Boudville. I'm the final year IMP3 unit coordinator, and I have the pleasure of helping to host this panel today. We have 4 of the final year students who got the perfect score in the Osce, and that means that they failed 0 Osce stations out of the 12 Osce stations that they just sat. Indeed, some of them got a 6 out of 6 global score for some of the stations, so they got the even more perfect score for some of these stations. So we're joined here also by JT, who's a 3rd year medical student who's going to help ask them some questions. So maybe you guys could introduce yourselves and then we can get the questions going.
I'm Jacob.
I'm Bri. Caitlin.
I'm Julian.
Perfect. JT.
Sweet. Congrats for finishing your Osce's, guys. So I guess the first question is, I just want to know what you did in preparation for your Osce's. Just a general question. Is there anything special you've done? Something that you didn't do?
I think the main thing was just catching up on a weekly basis, kind of having like a set schedule and then making a time where people are free to actually like consistently do it. Because I feel like that was the thing that let me down last year, was like not being familiar enough with the environment, and then just by practicing like consistently, like under time pressure as well, like 2 minutes to read a trigger, like 8 minutes in a station, and getting some feedback was the thing that was like most useful, I think.
When did you start practicing?
Like I think we caught up the week before we started MD4 and kind of figured out what day would work, and then as soon as we started, then just a weekly thing. And then by the time we got to the actual Osce, even standing in front of a trigger was way less intimidating than it was last year when we hadn't done as much prep.
Oh, sweet. So all the way from January to, say, September, you're on a weekly basis.
Yeah, and then on Bri Rudge GP as well, just doing over Zoom, because that can get pretty tricky. But
Sure. Nice.
Yeah, similarly to Jacob, I actually had 2 study groups at the start of the year. One from people that weren't in my rotation, so I hadn't even done anaesthetics yet, and I was already sort of practicing anaesthetics-based things with people that weren't in my rotation. And then I had a different study group that was people in my rotation, and we'd practice once a week under timed conditions. And with the group of people that weren't in my rotation, I actually made an Excel spreadsheet and set it up so that we would go through it as a circuit. And so there were 6 of us. We would do 3 stations in a row as if it were an Osce, and then the people that were doing the stations would then swap and mark 2, so that the person that was marking the station that they brought could do the other 2, and then we would swap over. So it was like people would do 3 stations in a row under time pressure, and would have 2 minutes, 6 minutes with the 2-minute warning, final 2 minutes. When that buzzer went off, your reading time had started and you'd have to get up and move to the next spot. So it was really emulating that stress. And also the stations we brought were ones that we wrote, which I actually think was one of the most helpful things for me, was preparing a station and being like, what would a very good candidate do in this setting, and what would be sort of the biggest obvious failable offences in this setting.
So would you say roughly it was like half an hour every week? 3 times 10 stations a week? That's what you were doing?
So we were doing 3 in a row, and then marking 2. So it was like a circuit, and there'd be 3 stations. And so there'd be people marking them and then people moving throughout. And then once you got to the end of doing the station, you would mark the one that you finished on, and the people who were marking when you were doing the station would do the 2 that they hadn't done. And then we'd swap over and change stations and basically repeat that process again. So it ended up being 3 + 5, 50 minutes times 2, so like 2-ish hours a week. And then generally afterwards we would give each other the marking keys that we'd filled out, and then go through general feedback, and get lunch or something afterwards, so that we weren't just miserable and studying sort of thing. So generally be like a bit of someone come over to my house at like 9 AM, a couple hours of study, and then go grab a cup of coffee or something. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Caitlin?
Yeah, so my study group was a bit different from MD3 to MD4. So in MD3 I had a group of 5 people in my study group, and we did Osce station, but we combined this with teaching sessions. So someone would bring a topic, so approach to jaundice for example, or developmental milestones for peds, and instead of them doing a station, they would be teaching a high yield topic. So we would do combinations of those in MD3, and we started about June, July, so a bit later in the year, because you do have until November. And then moving into final year, we had 2 new group members from RCS, which was great. So I was Metro last year. So it was good to have that mix, because they're guaranteed to have different teaching and learning experiences to us that stayed in Perth. So there were 7 of us, which was great because final year is such a busy year. We're all on different rotations. Sometimes people couldn't make it, and so you're guaranteed to have enough people to make it work in a similar way to what Bri was saying with the circuits and replicating it in those time-pressured scenarios. That's how we approached it. And we mainly wrote our own stations towards the end, because we knew what we needed to study on and what topics we couldn't find in all the Osce resources online, or things like that. And we mainly did it here at UWA, so we booked 2 study rooms, preferably close together, or we would go to other unis around UWA and we would swap rooms, so we'll have a couple of people in one, a couple of people in the other, and swap around. So that was the most time efficient way of doing things. So that was, and we started in March for this year, so we let ourselves kind of settle into that first rotation, especially some of us starting on ED. And then we kicked things off in March, and we're very regular, but also flexible, because it was hard to stick to one particular day.
Still on a weekly basis though, right?
Still on a weekly basis, and then closer to the end, we did twice weekly.
Sure.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Thanks. Julian?
I think now that we're getting to the end, I'm probably going to echo a lot of what has already been said in relation to study groups. So I had a study group of 4 people, and we met once or twice weekly from January. We did things very similarly. We would book a study room, and we would all meet, and we'd do 2 stations and mark 2 stations. We did all the disciplines from like the very beginning of the year. We made a note to make sure that we did that, because if you end on like anaesthetics, palcare and onc, you're going to really struggle to learn 3 disciplines like right before your exams. And that's what I ended on. So I was doing those stations right from the beginning, which was really helpful. The other thing that we did was every second week, one of us would present on like an approach to common stations. So as we were doing the stations, we started to find that there were certain stations that would come up all the time, like lifestyle counselling, or like A to E assessment in ED, and we make sure that we all had a really good framework for that, and we make it available on like a Google Drive, and we do those stations to death. Beyond like the study group side of things, the other thing that I did for preparation for OSCEs was focus on the centralised content that's on the LMS. I think UWA often draws stations and questions from like what's on the LMS, and I think people often overlook that. So before I did every discipline, I'd make sure I'd gone through the LMS, watched the recorded lectures, read through the, like all the required reading, and like write notes on what I thought was important. That was really helpful. The other thing is the core conditions document, which I know is huge and intimidating, as like, especially as MG2 and 3. But if you focus on the 3 pluses and 2 pluses, like they will be in your OSCEs, definitely. So make sure you have your head around them, especially like the clinical points. And the last thing I think I can add is just going to prac, really. And when I was on prac, this is probably the first year where I was like, okay, I'm going to actively try and identify like situations and patients that are like intern and OSCE relevant, and like practice the skills that I'm doing in an OSCE group, because it's like one thing to do a consent station with your friends, and it's another thing to practice that on a real patient who's going to go get their appendix taken out and then ask the intern to watch you and give you feedback, because it gets helpful for both you and the junior doctor, and that probably made the biggest difference for me. So yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So I mean, I get the sense that the really authentic experience, trying to keep the authenticity of the OSCE is a real theme amongst you guys. And interesting compared to previous years, you seem to write a lot more of your questions. Previous years seem to use a lot more of the online resources or pre-written questions. Is that right, or?
I think that I found that after the 3rd year OSCE, I was like some of what I practiced, I did reasonably well in the third year one as well. Like some of what I practiced was relevant, but also the UWA stations aren't necessarily always your typical Osce station. Like I think you guys intentionally make them a little bit different and a little bit specific to testing specific skills.
Can I answer that question actually?
Yeah.
We've never looked at one of those other stations, so we don't try to be just
Really? Okay.
create our own.
Yeah, so I found that like they're not necessarily the same as some of the ones online and some of the ones in the books and stuff. So like I sort of said to my study group, I was like, hey guys, how about this year we try to write our own stations and try to sort of base them off the way that the UWA ones have been sort of in the practice Mosques and in the FOSCE and in the MD3 ones, and try to keep that similar structure.
Jake, you look like you're nodding your head with a no.
Yeah, no, and I think that you get a lot more out of it if you write your own stations as well. And similar to what some of the other guys were saying, like if you are writing your own station, then you might present on the topic after someone's done the station or before, and then like as a marker, you're learning about the station and getting just as much out of it as the person who's doing the station that you've written. If that makes sense.
Okay, so you also wrote a lot of your questions.
Yeah.
I think, but also sometimes it's a time-consuming task to
Yeah.
write a station. And amongst the 7 of us this year, there were some of us that consistently drew from these online resources or previous stations that were written, and we tweaked them slightly. So we added in maybe investigation results that you needed to interpret, or tweaked it a little bit that we weren't writing them all from scratch, because sometimes there were some weeks where you just couldn't do that with your study load and prac. So yeah, it was a bit of a mix for us, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say for the record that I didn't write a single station the whole year. That we only used online resources because I think it's hectic to write your own station, but I applaud you guys for doing it. We did not find the time to do that. We had compiled, each of us bought an online resource, and we had some handed down from previous years. So we ended up having banks of thousands of Osces, and we wouldn't have gone through all of them throughout the whole year.
You said earlier, Julian, that you also taught your other friends, right? You presented, so you did some sort of
Yeah, but we didn't write any
Okay,
stations, so it'd be like, this is a handy way to approach a consent station, this is a framework that we can all memorise, and then we'd do the stations that we had bought, essentially, and use that framework. But I agree, a lot of them are American or from the UK, so the management is often slightly different. So obviously we'd check on ETG after, and be like, actually that antibiotic selection wasn't quite right or whatever. But no, nothing as intense as writing a station.
I found it fun though. I was like, ooh, this is fun. I'm gonna make up a little character.
Find Excel spreadsheets, mate.
Yeah, we had an Excel
So there seems to be also a theme of consistency, just doing it on a regular basis.
Yeah.
There seems to be a difference in the number of students in the group or the number of groups that you have. What's the ideal?
We had 3 people, because then you have one person marking, one person being a patient, and one person being the student doctor. And then we found that was good, just because then you could do maybe 3 stations as a student and then get some feedback, and then each person gets a chance to kind of do the a different role. And then because I'm not sure how you found it with bigger groups, but do you still get a lot of practice in if there's a lot of people around?
So in MD3 we did it where there was a big group of us, and one person did the station, one person marked it, one person was the actor, and then everyone else just kind of watched and gave vague feedback, and we're all very nice to each other. We're like, you did great, and then it was I feel like I'm wasting time, so then we did it as a circuit, and so it was just one person marking, one person doing the station, and then if the person marking had to be the actor, they did that as well. And I just found that was quite time saving, because you'd mark 5 different stations and do 5 different stations, and then the 6th station you'd made, and you'd do that within 2 hours, so it was a lot of active learning and not a lot of passive watching people do stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree with that. So having 7 this year, it was a lot, but we were efficient in the way that we did things, running it like a circuit, and we had a Excel spreadsheet as well, which was very, very useful. So we had all of our names up the top, and then down the bottom it was the weeks or kind kind of the rotations, so anaesthetics or internal med and surgery, and each week you would document the stations that you've done as kind of like this running recording, and at the bottom you would write stations that you weren't comfortable doing or what you wanted to learn. So there's lots of ways, whether you have a big or a small group, that you can ensure that you're all getting equal learning opportunity and equal time, because at the end of the day, like, the more practice the better. But you're also very time poor in MD4, so you want to make it, there's a plan, there's a structure, everyone knows what to do, everyone knows what to bring, and then you can get around it quite smoothly, I think. Yeah.
So I had a smaller study group of 4, and we break off into groups of 2 each week with a different partner. I think you can do whatever size Osce study group works for you. I think the important thing is selecting people who are going to give you good feedback. I think there's something to be said for being like too nice in your feedback. So if you're with all your best friends and you're like, oh my god, you did so great in that station, and you got like, I don't know, like you borderlined it. Like, you really need friends who are you're close enough that you can just be honest and sort of brutal with the feedback, but still constructive, obviously. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything out of it. So we sort of had a big discussion about it at the beginning of the year, that like, with our study group, that we were going to give direct feedback. It wasn't going to be like cushioned with compliments. It was just going to be what we're going to do better. And if we did bad in a station, we'd flag it and we'd do it again, like in a few weeks' time, to try and repeat the learning. So I know that's not a direct answer to your question about what the perfect size is, but I think it's the more relevant question is selecting the people who are going to do that for you.
It's great advice. Be respectful, but deliberate and honest. So I have many theories in my mind, but one of the theories I have is that you can only learn so much from one person. And I wonder if having the same group all year round, you're not learning as much from your study partners later on in the time, and maybe you need to mix things up and see other groups. I don't know, what do you think of that crazy theory of mine?
I think that makes sense, but I think practically, for at least our group, it was good to have like one group chat and just kind of logistically figure out when during the week was going to work to catch up. But then as we got closer towards exams and in the actual study period we had, like after the written exam, we had like a couple of days where it was like a full day of like a couple of different people. So we like merged 2 Osce groups and then did it that way. And we did learn like extra things. I picked up little like ways that people approach stations, or even just like little catchphrases and things that people use like in certain situations when like getting consent or something. So there definitely is value in having like mixing it up a bit. But I think practically I found that difficult. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, similar to you. Like I had my main group, but I also would, for instance, like Julian and I were on internal med together, and a few times we just sort of hung out together in the computer room and studied stuff. Or like, if you're on prac with someone and they seem pretty switched on, I'd say like, I'm gonna go take a history from this patient. Can you like give me some feedback? Or towards exams, like a few different study groups invited me to join them. Or like, if I wanted to do a bit more study and I had a bit of free time, I'd like message just one of my friends and be like, hey, do you want to like go through some stuff? I want to really be challenged this week. Can you like give me some difficult stuff and see how I go? So like, I think having the core group is good because it leads to consistency, but then being open to doing more is probably also a good idea, if that makes any sense.
I think you've all alluded to some form of this so already, but like since all of you have completed your OSCEs, done the perfect OSCE, what's one thing that you do that you think you do better than the average medical student? So I guess Caitlin, or I don't put anyone on the spot, but it's a bit of like a self-reflection, right? Like you've done really well, and you might not think that you've done really well, but like what's something that you think that other students don't do?
I don't know, I think we're just all so similar, and we all work hard, and I don't know if there's anything that I do.
Is it just about the work ethic that you put in a bit more practice, you're more regular, more consistent, or is there something else that you do?
Yeah, well, I think most of us do this. Like if you have a study group, you have a study session, and there was something that you really struggled with, or a structure that you didn't like, then you go home in your own time and kind of make up your own structure and study that. But I feel like we all do that once we reflect on how we performed in the study group, but yeah, I don't know anything specific, unique to me. I'll keep thinking about it and let you know, but...
I can think of one thing that I think all of us probably have in common is that we went to prac.
Yeah.
And that's the
one,
biggest,
yeah.
that we marked them with the mock Oskies, and I think it's really obvious which students have like actually gone to prac and been actively involved on prac and which ones haven't. Because they just have the clinical acumen, like they're really clever with how they approach something. If it's investigations, they can be like, this is bedside stuff that we're going to do, these are the bloods, this is the imaging, and they're just, you know, they're MD2 or MD3s, but they've been on the wards, they know what they're doing, and they really are focused. There are students who leave prac as quickly as they can and go home and study, and they probably put an equal amount of time, but they just can't do the station properly. So my biggest advice to someone in MD2 and 3, and even the first half of MD4, is go to prac, like do the hours. Like there's no other way around it. You have to be there. Like you have to stay and you have to actively be involved. Otherwise, you're not going to translate what you're learning in the books to real life.
Definitely.
And it shows in the Oski 100%.
Oh my God, that just resonates so much. I'm so glad you said it. I say that all the time when I'm remediating students, and it's a skill. It's a skill exam, and then you have to practice the skill with real people.
Yeah, it's like a real. I think that it's not like exams that you do in high school or undergrad, where it's like, oh, like let's look at this textbook forever. This is like a real world exam. It's about showing that you're experienced. And like the people who do well in the Oskies are not like this. It's not the smartest people in the cohort. It's the people who went to prac. And
enjoy going to prac
yeah,
as well.
100%.
And
And involve yourself.
Yeah.
Like sitting in the corner of a GP office is definitely less useful than doing Ankies, but getting up and clerking a patient and maybe even annoying your supervisor a little bit and being like, can I see this patient and then present to you? Can I do this and then like do this? Or if I help you with this, can you maybe like watch me speak to a patient later? Almost like bartering your free labour in exchange for teaching. Because like, you know, we're paying a decent amount of money for med school. The uni's getting this prac for us. Let's go and like make the most of it. And like, you know, these regs and consultants and stuff are all really smart people and a really good resource to have. And I always just kind of like shook my head a little bit at people that were leaving and going to read like a textbook. I'm like, why would you read that entire chapter when like Neil can teach me about the kidney in 10 minutes, what that chapter taught me in 2 hours, you know?
Yeah. And the patient can teach you more, and the patients like stick in your mind. Like when I've done exams in MD3 and MD4, and there's a question on like Parkinson's disease for some reason, I don't remember the book chapter. I remember a couple of patients that I've seen on the wards with that condition and with that disease, and then I can answer the question. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. That
Another trend I noticed with some other students, not necessarily you guys, was with COVID, there's a trend to practicing online for the Oskies. What do you think about that? All of you guys seem to talk about face-to-face practice sessions. How do you feel with online?
I did both, and I just found that like the in-person sessions, I have pretty bad ADD. I was more present in person ones. And that's just a me thing. I'm sure other people had other experiences, but I just find that I'm more engaged if there's someone there holding me accountable that can't tell that I'm also scrolling through Instagram over here, you know?
Yeah, definitely. It's different on rural GP though. So it's quite difficult to do it over Zoom or Teams and catch up with your study group. So sometimes we would use online resources and do individual study, but I'm very much the same. I prefer in person, and talking out loud things with other people is how I learn. So I can't really do that in front of a computer. Yeah.
One thing that the computer is good for is if you turn the camera off and practice like a telehealth, because that has come up previously, and then just knowing how to approach a telehealth station is like a skill in itself, because you could easily just like not get easy marks for introducing yourself, making sure that the line's okay, they can hear you, confirm who it is on the other end of the phone. Like if you're on rural GP, utilising that time to maybe practice some of those other stations is like I guess something that we found useful.
Yeah, we were almost exclusively like face to face. I think your Oskies are done face to face, so you should practice face to face. I think that's what we said. We're trying to replicate some kind of authenticity. So I think it's logical if you can meet face to face, do it, and if someone's sick or you're on Rural GP, online's fine.
What would you do differently? Now that you've done well, what would you do differently if you could do it again?
For some stations, not being afraid to ask the examiner to repeat something. So for example, halfway through the station, you ask for investigation results and they give them to you. I feel like you don't want to ask them again because you might think that they think that you weren't listening or something like that, but not being afraid to do that, just to double check your clinical reasoning, making sure that you didn't miss any details they said. I think that's one key thing that I would do in the future if I had to do it again. Yeah.
I think I found myself getting overwhelmed by big triggers like in the actual Osce and kind of just like losing myself a little bit. It might, maybe if I was to go back, actually just read what they want me to do first and then go back, make some sense of the trigger, and then you've got it with you in there anyway. But I found there are a few stations where I looked at the trigger, got halfway down, and then the buzzer went off, and then I was kind of like panicking a little bit as to like how I was going to approach the station when I hadn't even like read, am I taking history, am I like talking to them about management, but just looking at the bottom, what they want you to do, and then looking at the trigger just to not get flustered, because I think that was something that definitely put me off in a few stations, and I kind of felt a bit like unstable at times. But yeah, if I was going to do something, but one thing differently, that's probably the thing I'd do.
I think I'd like learned how to do a handover, but I think I needed to practice synthesizing information in front of me and then forming a handover like in a time pressured situation. Because I thought I was able to do a handover, and then I sort of did one and I was like, oh, that probably wasn't my best work. So I think, yeah, maybe there's things that I probably was a bit too confident in doing that I should have practiced a few more times, and probably handovers would have been one of them.
This is an interesting question. I think that one of the stations I did the poorest in was a station that I had practiced the most, which is kind of embarrassing to admit. I think that when I was at the door, I was like, oh yes, okay, I can pass this station. And I didn't write that much down on my paper because I was like, I've committed this to memory, I've practiced this so much. And so I wish I had maybe written down stuff in front of that station. So like using that 2 minutes appropriately to like, what I normally do is like write sort of how I'm going to approach the station and my structure, like who I am, who the patient is, all of that type of stuff. And I kind of forgoed that for that station, and it kind of really screwed me up. So my advice is, just like be ruthless with yourself in front of every door, like read the trigger properly, read it well, like write down exactly what you need to do and how you're going to do it. Yeah, even if you think you know what you're doing.
How do the rest of you use your 2 minutes?
I read what they wanted first, and then read the trigger, and then similarly I'd write some kind of variation of a structure down, and then so like for instance, if it was a resuscitation, I would write, doctors ABCDE, shock at this time, adrenaline this dose this time, amiodarone this dose this time, and then I'd draw a little box in the top corner and write down things that I thought were failable offences. So like, accidentally electrocuting someone or not turning on the defib or something like that. Like, just like things that I thought, okay, don't do these things.
Yeah, mine's quite similar. I would always read, because I'm a very slow reader, but always read the task first and then the trigger. And then I would either write it depends on the station and what the station's asking of you, but if it requires differentials, I'd always write them down because I felt like they flowed well out of my brain outside the trigger room, outside the room, but once you get in there it stops a little bit. Also red flags, similar to the failable offences that you were mentioning, and then a structure. So it was not much, and I'd always write the patient name, because that's something that I always struggle with when I walk in the door and you go blank, and it's just a nice thing to greet them with their name that's provided to you on the door.
And remember what your role is. And the amount of times I walk in and be like, hi, I'm Bri, I'm the intern here.
Same. Those were the two things I did. So very similar to Julian and Bri. Yeah.
role playing, if that's a key part of these Osce stations.
You do really have to suspend disbelief, like, you know, I'm fake sorry about your fake dad fake dying, and it's like you have to really practice that. And I think a way to do that is to actually just really suspend disbelief and be like, I know this is my mate Jacob, but no, it's Cheryl and her husband's dying, you know? Like, yeah.
Can I ask, in hindsight, what proportion of your study do you think was just purely Osce practice versus studying for the written exam or studying for life as a doctor? And
It's hard to know. Like, there's definitely study that I did very intentionally for Osce's, and like I knew that in the real world I wouldn't do it like this. So, you know, breaking bad news or like lifestyle counselling, I think doing that in 8 minutes is probably a little bit unreasonable. It's hard to give like a proportion, but I'd say, you know, a decent amount of time.
The majority?
I don't know, because a lot of study is like
It all overlaps.
Yeah, it overlaps a lot.
Yeah, I find that a lot of the written study was actually based on the Osce stations, because we kind of like do Osce stations based on whatever rotation we were on, and then it kind of goes hand in hand with some of the stuff that you're doing anyway. And so I might write some notes down on like what I learned from the Osce station, but like going up and like above and beyond what's on LMS, I didn't really do much of that. It was just like do the stuff that's on LMS, and then most of the other stuff was Osce stuff. Because I found that the Osce stuff was more engaging, like a lot more fun. Because like sitting at the library sucks. So like it's much more fun when you're there talking through stations with people. Like, because as much as it is study as well, it's also like you can have a bit of a laugh about it, or like go for a coffee afterwards, and it's kind of makes the year a lot more enjoyable, I think.
I have 2 questions related to like imposter syndrome. So the first one's a yes or no, and then I'll have a follow-up. But did you honestly ever think that you were going to fail your Osce's?
Yes.
The logical part of my brain was like, you've done really well this whole time, why would you get flagged now? Like, that's ridiculous. But there's always that, anxious part of my brain that's like, what if, the 3 things that you didn't study are the entire Osce? What if you actually just got lucky the past 7 years at university? Yes, I did think I would fail, but then there was still that logical part of me that was like, realistically, you're not going to. But like, the logical part of my brain and the anxious part of my brain don't talk to each other, which is really annoying of them. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm very similar to Bri. I think we're all perfectionists, and we all like to tear ourselves down a little bit and think of the worst case scenario and how we're going to avoid the worst case scenario. And I think we'll all be good doctors because we're trying to avoid that and make sure the patient is safe and everything's going to plan. But I would definitely have those thoughts sometimes, be a bit dramatic about it to my friends and family, and they're like, Caitlin, seriously? When have you ever failed? But I think we all have those thoughts.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that like all med students are probably a bit pathological, and that's probably why we're here. I think like Osce's are inherently unpredictable, so that's inevitably going to provoke a little bit of fear. But I think by the end, I was relatively confident in the preparation that I had done, that I thought that if I failed, I'd be content with failing because I couldn't have done any more work. I was like, oh god, I'm so ready for this to be over. I don't know about you guys, but by the end I was like, let's get this done.
Yeah. And after walking out of the Osce, I think there was a big relief as well. Like, I felt satisfied. I was like, there was like maybe 1 or 2 stations I could have done better in, but overall, there was this sense of satisfaction. I didn't really think about it in those weeks leading up to our results, which I think was a good sign as well. I
actually just remembered I had a little bit of a mantra in my head during exams, and this is incredibly arrogant, and you can edit this out if you want, Neil. But I was like, I am someone who's worked hard, I'm someone who's showed up to prac, I'm someone who's done well the whole time. If I failed this exam now, it would be a failure of the assessment, not a failure of me, which I know is an arrogant thing to think, but it helped me like chill out.
I didn't mind most of it until the end bit, but
it was, you know, it's not something that I was going to say out loud amongst my peers going into the exam, and probably not something I foresaw myself saying directly to you, Neil, but it did help me sort of calm down a bit, because it was like, even if you do fail, you're not a failure. Sometimes things just happen and it's okay.
yeah. I think if you've done the work, you've gone to placements, you're going to pass.
Mm.
You know, unless you have an incredibly bad day, but that doesn't happen for you guys. There was another question.
The follow-up is a little bit about the arrogance as well, but I guess we can put that aside now. Can you reflect on yourself and actually say, do you think I'm good I'm good at doing OSCEs?
I don't know about good, but I think just the practice paid off in the end. Because like, I think going back to the, do you think you could fail? Like I failed a couple of stations last year, and I think that kind of played on my mind a bit. But the thing that helped with the reassurance was kind of like what these guys said. Like, if you've put in the work, then even if you do fail, like it's unlikely, but if you do, like you can just hands down say, no, I've done everything I can. So yeah, I don't know.
I think that'll be a bit of a relief, because I think, as you say, a lot of third years even be like, oh, I don't feel like I'm doing enough. But if you've scored the perfect score and you can also have that same emotions going through, then I think that will fare well for us.
Absolutely. So I might just start finishing off, but maybe we'll give each of you a chance. Is there anything else you want to mention or talk about?
I guess like one thing that was really helpful in like the day leading up to the OSCE was that throughout the year I kind of made like a little bit of a log on like a Word document of what stations we'd done and like what we did well and what we did poorly for each of those stations. So like the night before the OSCE I was just kind of like not doing any hardcore study, but just like kind of what Bri said about failable offences, like what have I done previously like badly and what to just like look out for, and just to kind of like, you can't cram or anything, but just to like reinforce some of the things that you've learned throughout the year that are really important. And yeah, just consistency and go to prac.
Yeah. Great.
So like everything we've said about practice or whatever is like definitely the main thing you want to do. I think one thing that I forgot to mention is me and one of my friends met up in the library a few times and did like OSCE strategy sessions, and we'd actually just write out approaches to specific types of stations. So like I had a framework for a consent, I had a framework for a targeted history, and you know, some of these frameworks I didn't even use, some of them I don't remember, but I think just the act of deconstructing something and trying to figure out what is being assessed and what I need to show was really helpful. And actually we have that document if any MD3s want it. And then resources wise, radiology masterclass is incredible for x-rays and CTs and things. Life in the Fast Lane is the best for ECG practice. And then there's this book, it's like a PDF book, and it's called Unofficial Guide to Medicine, and it has a bunch of chest x-rays and abdo x-rays and ortho x-rays that are like fully interpreted and annotated, can't say that. And that I only found it about a month leading up to the OSCE, and I would sort of go through that essentially at the end of the day when I couldn't stomach any more Ankies. I was like, this is a bit more fun, and I'd go through them, or I'd like go through some cases and things like that. And I just think, yeah, practicing interpreting things is definitely very helpful as well.
Tips. Okay.
Yeah, I've got a few do's and don'ts. My big thing is just the classic, like take care of yourself throughout the year. And so for me, prioritising exercise was the biggest thing, and for some people it might be just seeing friends or doing their hobbies, but I think that's the most important thing because it is a busy year. And on the actual OSCE day, try and eat brekkie, especially if you're a brekkie person, as much as you can. And you can lightly look over notes, but just really relax in the morning before and make sure your transport's organised and you know where you're going. And my big don't for the OSCE day is I remember, I think it was MD3, when we walked into the kind of quarantine room before going into the OSCE, there was a few students that were cramming, talking about antibiotics and just all this nitty-gritty stuff, and it was making everyone else around them very anxious. And I was with two of my friends, and we moved to the other end of the room, and we were talking about holidays, and it was such a good technique because all three of us went in very happy and in a good mood. We weren't worried about antibiotics, which you look up on ETG anyway as a junior doctor. So that would be those would be my big tips as well, and everything else that we've already talked about. Sharing resources with your friends in a Google Drive. So after each study session, if you'd come up with good strategies, as Bri said, or good stations, having them all together in one centralised drive is really, really useful. And sleep is the big one as well. So the weeks leading up to the Osce, make sure you're having your 7 to 9 hours sleep, because the night before the Osce is really unpredictable. Some of us will fall asleep and have a lovely night's sleep, but you just don't know if you're going to be up all night, so you need to prepare yourself well. So working out what's best for you, but with good sleep hygiene is another big one. Yeah, that's all for me. Yeah.
I think I'm going to echo again a lot of what's already been said. I wrote down a few things. So I think the first thing is that MD4, and I guess your whole medical degree is actually really stressful, and I think that sometimes we forget that medicine can be quite heinous, it's a really hard degree, and there were definitely points in the year where I honestly felt I felt stressed and I found the year difficult. And I was really lucky that I had a really supportive group of friends that I could lean on, and we were able to work together. So the first thing I guess I'd like to say is just support your friends and work together, because they're going to be your colleagues for the next X many years, and you're really lucky to have each other. It's such a smart cohort of people. It's easy to slip into being competitive with them, but it shouldn't be like that. You really have to run your own race in medicine and work together. The other things I wanted to touch on were about, I guess, the Osce day itself, and Caitlin said a lot of really good things. I kind of treated the Osce as if it was a sporting match. So I was in the days before, I was counting how many carbs I had, making sure I had enough fluids, I was sleeping 8 hours, and I was I was visualising the day. But I wasn't studying in the day, the day 24 hours before. I didn't look at anything. So I treated it like a sporting match, and it was the best way to do it, because I woke up and I was just ready to go, and I had so much adrenaline. It was good. So yeah, try to de-stress or de-escalate that Osce day as best you can, because it's a difficult day. The other thing that I wanted to say was you kind of have to treat the stations a bit like a drama performance. So you go in and you should be really confident in your preparation, and just make sure you say, "Hi, I'm Julian, I'm the Gen Surge RMO. I've been told that you have abdominal pain. Can you tell me what's going on?" Hand sanitize and sit down. And if you start the station just really clearly, it just sets the tone for the rest of it. So I guess the top tips are de-stress, be confident, and take it seriously, but take care of yourself in the same breath.
Fantastic, pure gold. Thank you. I'd like to thank for the newest admitted doctors, Julian, Caitlin, Bri, and Jacob. And thank you, JT, for helping out with the interview. And we'll hopefully see you all in the next video too. Thanks.
Okay.